We read through history in the Bible, and sometimes it makes us feel comfortable because we can say, I am never going to be a king, right? And I am never going to have a kingdom, and I'm never going to have to be a part of this in which my actions and my responses creates what in fact is a civil war. But if you read through the story from 2 Samuel today carefully, you see it's not about kingdoms primarily. It begins within the family of King David. King David was a man after God's own heart and a man to whom we have great admiration, and we see that God used him in incredible ways. And in many ways, he's all the things that we want to be, in the sense that here is this guy who is successful and strong and mighty. And yet, in his own home, he is a failure. David had started with all the wrong things. We understand that. He had, we know, at least 7 wives and a home of Jezreel, Abigail of Carmel, Maacah of Maacah, Haggith, Abital, Eglah, and Bathsheba, which is also Bathsheba. And unless Eglah was also known as Micah, Saul's daughter, then there would be 8. But that wasn't enough. And then all the concubines. Now, I'm not being totally tongue-in-cheek. 1 wife is enough to keep you busy. 1 husband is more than enough to keep you busy. You see, he had taken on this mindset for 2 things. Why do you get a wife? First of all, for pleasure. And second of all, for political expediency. It's amazing that in several thousand years, nothing has really changed. Those things still come to the forefront so many times. And so what he had done was, instead of having a family, he had groups of families that were being raised in different households. Each mother was raising a different household. They were almost single moms. There was no community, and they were being raised in different value systems. Let me suggest those are things we can learn from, not to model, but in terms of those important theological lessons I learned before I started to school from Romper Room. There's not only Mr. Do Be, there's Mr. Don't Be. And in this case, it's Mr. Don't Be. You see, we come to this story and we see dysfunctionality not only between father and son, but between brothers and sisters and mothers and stepmothers. And it begins with Amnon seeing with his eyes, much as his own father David had with Bathsheba, and he sees, in this case, his stepsister, his half-sister, Tamar, and he is pierced to the heart. Now, pierced to the heart may give you the idea that this is love. It is, if you consider love to be that 19th century romanticism in which my destiny has come to me. I want to suggest that understanding of romance is not biblical and has done a great deal of damage to our society. I am not suggesting romance is a bad thing. I am married after all, and I am not going to make those comments. Look, romance is not about a momentary thing. This is the thing about our world. They see romance as something that happens to someone that in all likelihood you don't even know. You notice that? And why is it that your heart is going pitter-patter? Because of the way they look. Right? Romance in 2018 is like pyrite. What's another name for pyrite? Fool's gold. And here's this bright, shiny thing. You say, isn't it wonderful? And it's worth zip. But Amnon had to have Tamar. And he goes through this in chapters 13 and 14. We see this whole story play out. And here he says, I am sick. I'm sick at heart as well body, and I need my half-sister to bring me and feed me cakes by hand. You would think David would understand that this was not exactly a normal behavior, but he doesn't. See, he's not that involved in his own kids' lives that he understands what seems to work, and it's like, oh, that sounds like no problem. But it's all a ruse on his part because he is going to get what he wants. And so he grabs her and he says, we are going to have intercourse. And she says, no, brother, do not do this thing. And he forces her. And the moment he has what he has desired, he hates her. And Absalom finds out about this, and he's angry, but he does nothing yet. But he says it's all right. He takes his sister in, for she is his full sister. And David finds out about it, and David is furious. But David does nothing. Absalom does not continue to do nothing. And he traps his brother. His men kill him. And now David must respond, and Absalom flees. And there's brokenness. Finally, time passes, and we go through the story of the restoration, but the restoration is only partial. Because though Absalom is back, he never gets to see his father. There's still that wall. The wall that both of them had helped to build. And we come to the text today from chapter 15. And Absalom now gets himself a chariot and horses and 50 men to run before him. Understand that scene? Now he is going to show himself to be a man of importance. No longer just in the shadow of his father David, now he's going to be important in himself. And so he does the kinds of things we do. He goes out and he buys himself a Porsche. And he has an entourage with him. All the things of significance and importance he wants to show he has, but it's not just things that show importance. He has actual power, and he has this entourage of those people who will be the beginning of an army. And they recognize that in him, they themselves can become powerful. And so they surround him. He makes himself look impressive. And he develops an important and strong clique around him. And then he begins to manipulate people. Whenever anyone had a grievance to bring before the king for a settlement, Absalom called out to them as he had stationed himself outside the city gate, "What city are you from?" And if he replied, "Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel," Absalom said to him, "Look, your claims are good and right, but the king doesn't have anyone to listen to you. If only somebody would appoint me judge in the land. Then anyone who had a grievance or dispute could come to me, and I would make sure he received justice." He wanted to come before the people and say, "You have a champion." And if you didn't think there were grievances before, you better believe I'm going to let you know there are grievances that you should be having. See, that's the way in all times in history it works. Whether your name is Castro or Lenin or Hitler, I am going to make your life spectacularly wonderful. Right? Isn't that always the claim? And it doesn't really matter which political party. They're always going to tell you how wonderful it's going to be with them and that your grievance is with the other political party. And we always go to the polls and we vote and say, now, if our candidate wins, now it's all going to be where we want it to be. Well, maybe at some point we start to say, maybe that's not going to be the answer after all. But the same kind of things happen, not only in a kingdom, but also in other relationships. We try to make ourselves important. We try to diminish others. And this is exactly what Absalom is doing here. And he manipulates people. Look, I'm your champion. Here's your reason for needing change. And if you want to have a mental picture of who he is, think of the greasiest, oiliest politician you ever knew. I know none ever existed in New Mexico. But we used to see them in Texas. I mean, you know, these guys who just come up to you and they will sell you the Brooklyn Bridge as someone who's never left Albuquerque in your life. And you get around them and you just kind of want to wash the oil off. You know what I mean? That's exactly what he's doing. But it's amazing, and I've never understood this. You know those really oily, slick individuals? How many people follow them? And Israel starts to rally to Absalom. Israel can be really something great if David is no longer around. Now for us, that sounds like a ludicrous statement. King David, he is the king that everyone points to. In the Bible, he's the king after God's own heart. And yet, they would even reject him. 4 years had passed. And now Absalom says to David, "Let me go to Hebron because I made a vow to the Lord and I want to fulfill it." I made a vow when I was in Geshur of Aram, saying, if the Lord really brings me back to Jerusalem, I will worship the Lord in Hebron. And so David sends him off with his blessing. He was creating space, because you need that space if you're conducting a revolution, so that you have a place that you can do the last minute gathering, and you have the space to give you time that you can start the uprising. Because the most dangerous moments of an uprising are at the very onset. So now he's separated. And now the whole coup is being prepared. He sent agents throughout the tribes of Israel with this message. When you hear the sound of the ram's horn, you are to say, Absalom has become king in Hebron. And 200 men from Jerusalem went with Absalom, who had been invited and yet were going innocently because they didn't know the whole picture. You see, not only were there those conspirators, but then there were those who were sucked in and had a choice to make at the last moment. Live for Absalom or die for David. Simple as that. And even Ahithophel the Gileonite, who was one of the key advisors to David, went and threw his lot in with Absalom. And now the balance of power was shifted. And now clearly David was on the losing side. Now, I want you to think about how this started. This all started from brokenness within this family. And surely nations are not going to rise and fall from anybody in this room at this moment. But those family relationships are key in our hearts and our lives, and their impact goes far beyond anything that we can imagine. What are the mistakes that David made that we can avoid and we can counsel others to avoid? First of all, recognize where strong families begin. They begin with strong biblical principles. Who are you? You are a person who has a grounding in what God calls you to be. A grounding what you do because what God has called you to do. And think about how David began. He began with a roving eye, personal pleasure, and political expediency. Secondly, and I cannot make this strong enough, a strong family is built on the foundation of a strong marriage. For this reason, Jesus says, a man will leave his father and mother, and the two will become one flesh, so they are no longer two, but one flesh. See, David is in this situation in which there is no one marriage. There are multiple relationships, none of which can be strong and stable because they fail in principle for him to be one with one other. If you want to know what that household is like, perhaps you saw one of the reality shows about those who have the old Mormon beliefs in which they still believe in polygamy. Except I think they clean up the dysfunction. Right? Probably a much better indicator is, what would you do if your spouse brought home someone else? There will be time for confession later. But imagine the incredible dysfunction of these households. The Proverbs say, A house is built by wisdom, established by understanding, by knowledge. The rooms are filled with every precious and beautiful treasure. That's what a strong family is built on. Justice is also a key ingredient because justice is as necessary in a family as in a nation. When we don't deal with sin and hurt and pain within families, the families will crumble. We have to be honest about injustice. We have to bring resolution. We live in a grace that doesn't overlook sin, but treats sin as a disease that it must be excised so that all may be healthy. Where love lapses, hate flourishes. If there's nothing I haven't learned anecdotally from over 30 years of ministry, it's this. If someone feels betrayed and hurt by someone that they deeply care about, they do not go from deep feelings of love to apathy. To truly hate, you must first truly love. I can't promise that's true, but again and again I've seen it. Families look to the needs and welfare of one another, and as it says in 1 Corinthians 15, the New Living Translation, love does not insist on its own way. See, I don't particularly like that one. You know? Because love means getting what I want. Don't you like that version better? Totally unscriptural. But isn't that what David wanted from his relationships, from his wives? Bathsheba, give me what I want. Wife, give me what you want. That's not conducive to strong marriages. Rather, it's as we become one flesh, what do? We look at each other and we seek first their good. And we recognize our good is tied with theirs. Love means no longer being selfish, but now being outwardly focused. And finally this, which is, you would think a no-brainer, but somehow we turned off our mind to it. Raise up a child in the way that he or she should grow. And when he is old, he will almost always stay. Just as a gardener may train a tree in a certain way, so we raise our children. We can't control what happens, but their natural inclination is to grow the way that we have helped them. It is always a blessing when our children turn out better than we raised them. And if our children are wonderful children, then we've been blessed. Because most of us can remember mistakes we've made, right? But it's not just every specific, it's that genuine. Have we invested in our children the understanding of what they are as children of God? And have we directed them to living a life that is focused in that way? And if we do, we may still not be successful, but overwhelmingly it is the way to raise a child, and also often they will grow into being extraordinary people. Finally, I want to say one last thing, which seems to have gone out of vogue over the last half century. Build worship into the life of your family. Oh, yes, take them to church. Let them be involved in Sunday school and those things. Those are important things. But don't leave it to the church. Raise them with the family altar. Family altar is that time when we come together, that we set apart. We come with our children and we together say our lives are built on Jesus Christ. And so we worship Him not one day a week, but every day. It's a part of who we are as a family. Whether that family is 2 or 22. We make a time for God and we worship Him because we know He is central. See, the problem that Israel had as a nation was they always wanted to have a king that would make them great. And the reason why even King David didn't fit the bill was Israel must have God as its king. Our families must have God as its king. We must be His. So take the time to be a family of worship or a couple of worship. If therefore our houses, Matthew Henry says, if therefore our houses be houses of the Lord, we shall for that reason love home, reckoning our daily devotion the sweetest of our daily delights, and our family worship the most valuable of our family comforts. A church in the house will be a good legacy. Nay, it will be a good inheritance to be left to your children after you. The time you spend with your children and grandchildren and family in celebrating God is time that will be deeply invested in their life. In fact, it may be the difference when they face the difficulties as adults, that they go back and they remember the God whom they serve. And so we call each other to be families deeply rooted in Jesus Christ and to recognize that the failure to build these things into our families are too often born and bred in dysfunctionality.